Chapter 3, Weapons. Samurai were experts at fighting on horseback and on the ground. To do this well, they needed different kinds of weapons. Early samurai used mainly bows and arrows. By the 11th century, the samurai had become experts with swords. In fact, they were probably the greatest swordsmen of all time. Several hundred years later, they added cannons and guns. Bows and arrows. Warriors shot their arrows with the yumi or longbow. They fired them from the back of galloping horses or on foot. Their bows were made of bamboo or wood. It took a lot of strength to use a yumi, but the samurai could usually aim it and hit their target from about 150 feet away. Yumi were usually over 6 feet long. A samurai had to practice for years before he could shoot well from the back of a galloping horse. The rider controlled his horse with his knees. He had to drop his horse's reins and grab one arrow after another from his quiver. He brought the bow up to his ear and fired off the arrows with a deadly aim. There were many kinds of arrows. Before a battle, soldiers sent out signal arrows that sounded like whistles. They used them to send messages or to alert the enemy that it was time for the battle to begin. There were also arrows shaped like open scissors to cut through armor. Other arrows sent balls of fire into the air. The most deadly arrows had hooks or barbs on the end of them. Spears. Spears, or yari, were other important weapons. Some were short for close-up fighting. Others were long for fighting at a distance. Samurai charged the enemy with their spears. If the enemy attacked, they formed a wall of spears for protection. Their spears had flat blades that could be between 6 inches and 3 feet long. Some spears had such long wooden handles that a samurai on the ground could bring down a soldier on horseback from 20 feet away. Swords. Samurai used swords along with the bow and arrow. Eventually, it became the custom to always carry 2 swords. The most deadly sword was the longer one, called the katana. The smaller was the wakizashi. The 2 swords together were called daisho, which means big and small. Samurai were the only people allowed to have these swords. A samurai thought it was an insult when someone touched his sword without asking permission. If he got really mad, he might even kill that person on the spot. Samurai practiced with their weapons all of their lives. Soul in the sword. A sword was not just a weapon to a samurai. It was a magical symbol of all that he stood for. Some even believed that their souls lived in their swords. Losing a sword was a terrible thing. Samurai even gave their swords special names. When a samurai boy was born, a small sword was placed in his room. He got his first real sword when he was about 13. During his life, he slept with his sword under his pillow. When an old samurai died, his sword was beside his bed. Sword makers. Japanese sword makers created the most amazing weapons in history. For them, making a sword was a sacred duty. Before they began work, they fasted and prayed. Making a sword could take many months. While sword makers worked, they wore white robes like Buddhist priests. The sword makers' job was to make blades that stayed sharp and wouldn't break. To do this, they hammered layers of soft and hard steel together into thin sheets. When they finished, the sword had thousands of very, very thin layers. The inside was soft enough that it wouldn't snap. The outside was hard enough to remain sharp. Samurai passed their swords down to their sons as family treasures. Matchlock guns. In 1543, sailors from Portugal were shipwrecked on a Japanese island. They showed people their matchlock guns. The Japanese began making these, and soon samurai were fighting with them. Owning a gun was a sign of importance. Warriors often painted their family crests on them. The matchlock was popular for over 300 years. Matchlock gun. A short time after matchlocks, cannons were added to their list of weapons. Guns and cannons changed Japanese warfare forever. Instead of fighting face to face, samurai could now fight from a distance. War fans. On hot days, samurai cooled off with fans called gunsen, which hung from their belts. They had other kinds of fans that they used as weapons or as signals. At home, or when meeting a person of higher rank, a samurai usually didn't carry a sword with him. To be safe, he kept a heavy iron folding fan called a tessen at his fingertips. A tessen was handy for several things. It could act as a shield to ward off arrows or spears. If used as a hand flipper, it made a good swimming aid as well. And if a samurai really needed to, he could throw it at anyone who threatened him. Getting bashed in the head by a heavy iron fan was really painful. Gumbai were larger fans that didn't fold. They were made of big metal discs. The samurai used them as umbrellas and shields. Commanders also pointed with them to signal their troops.